Wyoming Territory, February 1882. Snow fell in slow, heavy flakes as Harlan Avery tightened his coat and steered his horse off the main trail, the wind cutting sharp through the pines. He had not planned to ride this far west, but something in his gut, the kind of pull that had saved his life more than once, made him veer toward the hills. He had been riding alone for weeks, driving cattle through the wind-bitten plains, sleeping under stars that offered no warmth. 33 years old and still no one waiting for him at the end of the road. Just him and the cold. Then he saw the smoke. Faint and thin, barely more than a ghost rising through the trees. He slowed his horse, eyes narrowing. There was no homestead marked on this stretch of land, no ranchers, no trappers. Just forest and snow and silence. But someone was out there, and judging by the lean of the smoke, their fire was dying. Harlan dismounted and led his horse up the narrow path, rifle slung across his back. He found the shack at the edge of a frozen creek, small, weather-stained, and half sunk into the earth like it had given up on being noticed. A broken shutter flapped loose in the wind. The door hung crooked. He stepped forward, boots crunching snow. "Hello," he called. "Anyone inside?" A sound answered him. Not a voice. A baby's cry. Harlan froze for half a breath, then shoved the door open. Inside was dim and cold, the fire barely flickering in the stone hearth. The air smelled of damp wood and something raw, blood and fear. On the floor near the hearth lay a woman, barely conscious, her skin pale as ash. In her arms, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, was a newborn. She blinked slowly up at him, her lips cracked. "Do not take him," she whispered. "I will not take anything," Harlan said gently, kneeling beside her. "You need help," she shook her head once, weakly. "He is only 2 days. I had no one else." "What is your name?" She hesitated, then said, "Helena Langley." Harlan took off his coat and draped it over her and the child. "All right, Helena," he said, voice steady. "I am going to help you. But we need to move. You and the baby will not last the night in this cold." She looked down at the infant, whose face was flushed and wet with tears. "His name is Jonah." "Okay, Jonah." Harlan leaned closer, wrapping the baby tighter before sliding one arm under Helena's back. She gasped in pain but did not fight him. "I have a cabin about an hour from here. You hold on, all right." She nodded, barely. Harlan carried her to the horse, lifting her into the saddle with practiced care. Then he tucked Jonah into her arms and mounted up behind her, holding her steady with one arm as he turned the horse back toward his cabin. The ride was slow. Snow thickened around them, and the wind worsened. Helena leaned against him, barely conscious, her breath shallow in the cold air. Jonah cried only once, then went quiet again, too still for comfort. When they reached the cabin, Harlan slid from the saddle and caught Helena before she could fall. He carried her inside, kicking the door shut behind them, and laid her gently on the bed. Then he turned to the stove, throwing in wood until the fire roared. He worked quickly, boiling water, finding clean cloth, checking the baby's breathing. He had not done this before, but instinct beat panic. He kept the child close to the warmth, wrapped tight, and cleaned Helena's wounds as best he could. She drifted in and out, once reaching for his hand. "Thank you," she murmured. "You do not need to thank me," he said, but her fingers curled around his. By morning, the storm had passed. Helena was asleep, color returning to her cheeks. Jonah lay swaddled in a wool blanket near the stove, breathing slow and steady. Harlan sat at the table, watching them both. His heart beat different now, slower, heavier. Like something had shifted in him. He had not meant to find anyone. He had not expected to feel like this. But watching Helena sleep, her hair dark against the pillow, her face soft in the firelight, and that newborn, so small and alive, Harlan felt something break open in his chest. He had spent years riding from town to town, never staying, never hoping. But now, there was someone in his bed, a baby in his home, and for the first time in a long time, he did not feel alone. Helena woke slowly, eyes blinking open in the golden morning light. She looked around the room, confusion flickering before she found Harlan sitting nearby. "You stayed," she said softly. "I did," Harlan said. "You and Jonah are safe now." She looked toward the baby, then back at him. "You really brought us here. You were half frozen, Helena. I was not going to leave you in that shack." A long pause. "Then, you saved our lives." Harlan stood and poured her a cup of water. "Drink this, you need your strength." As she drank, her gaze never left his face. Why did you come out that way? There is nothing near that shack. I do not know, he admitted. Something pulled me off the trail. Their eyes met, and in that quiet, something passed between them, not loud or sudden, but sure. She set the cup down. My husband died in December. Fever took him before Jonah was born. We had nothing left, no one to help. I am sorry, he said quietly. I was not expecting anyone to find us, she added. I thought we would die there. Well, you did not, he said, voice rough. I will make sure you do not. Helena looked down at her hands for a moment, then back at him. Why? Harlan hesitated, then stepped closer. Because I do not want to be alone anymore, he said, and I do not think you do either. She reached out and touched his hand. No, she whispered. I do not. Morning passed slowly. Harlan took to the chores without speaking much, keeping a steady rhythm as he sawed wood behind the cabin. The snow had crusted overnight, and the sky had cleared, pale blue overhead. His shirt clung to his back by the time he wiped his hands on his trousers and stepped inside. Helena stood near the stove, one hand braced on the table, the other wrapped around a cup. Her hair had come loose, falling over her shoulder in uneven strands. She looked up when the door opened but said nothing. The baby slept in a basket near the hearth, bundled in one of Harlan's spare flannel shirts. You should be resting, he said, brushing snow from his sleeves. I've rested enough, Helena replied, her voice stronger than the day before. Lying still too long makes me feel like I've died and forgotten to leave. He nodded and set about filling a basin with warm water. You want something to eat, I can manage it. He didn't push. She moved slow, careful with each step, but she reached the cupboard and pulled down a tin of beans, setting it beside the skillet. He handed her a knife without asking, and she began slicing dried onion into small pieces. Where'd you pick this spot? She asked after a while. You're not from these parts. No, he said. Was driving cattle through Laramie trails last summer, ended up near Green River after the job. This place was empty, so I fixed it up. Figured I'd winter here. She stirred the skillet with the edge of the knife. You own it. No, not sure who does. No one's come asking. She gave him a look that was almost amused. So you're a squatter. I prefer temporary tenant. She cracked a smile, faint but real. You're lucky no one's run you off. I've been run off worse. The baby stirred, giving a soft whimper. Helena set the knife down and crossed the room, lifting Jonah and swaying gently. Her movements were practiced, quieting him without words. You've done this before? Harlan asked. She nodded. I had a sister. She died young, but I helped raise her girl for a few years. Till her man remarried. He leaned against the wall near the window, watching her rock Jonah with a steady rhythm. You planning to stay in the territory? I don't know. I hadn't thought that far. You'll need somewhere come spring. I know. He crossed his arms, then uncrossed them. There's room here. Could build something more permanent out back. I've got tools. Helena looked over, her expression unreadable. You offering? I am, she held his gaze. Why? Because I think you'd make a good neighbor. Neighbor, she echoed, her tone dry. He didn't answer right away. I don't want to be someone who passes through anymore. She looked down at Jonah, then back at him. You saying that because we're here now, or were you already tired of leaving? I was tired long before I found you in that shack. She tucked the blanket tighter around Jonah's legs. I don't have anything to give you. I'm not asking for anything. You might later. He stepped closer, voice quiet. I won't. She studied him, something shifting in her face, not trust, not yet, but the weight in her shoulders eased a little. If we stay. I'd want to earn my keep. There's plenty here to do. I can sew, clean, cook if you don't mind plain food. I've eaten worse. She looked toward the window where the trees stood dark against the snow. I'll think about it. That's fair. She crossed back to the table, one hand still patting Jonah's back. You ever been married? No, why not? He considered her for a moment. Didn't know how to be needed. Helena's eyes lingered on his face. Then she sat down slowly, cradling Jonah in the crook of her arm. Maybe you just hadn't met the right need yet. He poured water into 2 mugs and handed one to her. Their fingers brushed. She didn't pull away. Neither of them spoke again, but the silence between them no longer felt like an absence. It felt like something beginning. By the 5th day, the snow had begun to crust over with ice, and Helena stood long enough to sweep ash from beneath the stove, her steps deliberate but steadier. Harlan watched from the doorway, wiping his hands on a sackcloth after stacking chopped wood behind the cabin. She hadn't asked for help once that morning. He cleared his throat. There's a creek about half a mile south, flows under the ice this time of year. If you're up for the walk, it's good to move some. Helena looked up from the broom. Is that an invitation or a suggestion? Both. She tied the shawl tighter beneath her chin. Give me 5 minutes. Harlan waited outside while she bundled Jonah in a quilt and secured him inside a sling she'd fashioned from one of his old shirts. Once ready, she stepped onto the porch, her breath catching at the sharp air. He nodded toward the trees. Stay close to the pines. Winds worse out on the open slope. They walked without speaking, boots leaving twin tracks over the frozen ground. The forest was brittle and quiet, branches bare except for pockets of snow that hadn't yet fallen. Harlan moved ahead, breaking trail when the drifts deepened, glancing back now and again to make sure she kept pace. At the creek, they paused. A thin ribbon of water ran dark beneath the ice, gurgling softly. Helena crouched near the bank, her hand resting lightly on Jonah's back. The baby stirred but didn't wake. She looked up. You always know where the water runs. Only if I've been somewhere long enough. You planning to stay through spring? He crouched beside her, resting his forearms on his knees. I was thinking about it. Do you want to keep ranching? Not sure I want to go back to it. She watched the water for a while. I was a school teacher once in Illinois. He turned to her. What brought you west? My husband had cousins homesteading near Cheyenne, thought we'd claim land. Build something of our own. She brushed a thumb over the edge of Jonah's sling. Didn't work out like we hoped. He didn't ask more. The silence settled easy between them, broken only by the water's slow movement and the wind threading through the pines. She stood after a while, brushing off her skirt. I miss reading. Books, haven't opened one since the train ride west. There's a Bible in the chest and a book of poems. Came with the place. She raised an eyebrow. Poems? Somebody left them behind. I didn't throw them out. I'd like to see them. They started back, the sun low behind the ridge. A hawk passed overhead without sound. Harlan slowed his steps so she could walk beside him. You ever think about what you'd do if you weren't alone anymore? She asked, eyes forward. I think about it now. She didn't answer, but after a moment her gloved hand brushed against his. Not by accident, they didn't speak again until they reached the cabin. The door creaked as Harlan pushed it open. Helena stepped inside first, then turned to face him. You were right, she said. It's good to move again. He closed the door behind them. Tomorrow I'll show you the path that loops near the ridge. Sun's warmer up that way. She nodded, rocking Jonah gently as she stepped toward the fire. And after that, I'll teach you how to use the axe. If you want. She glanced over her shoulder, a flicker of something new in her eyes. I do. He added wood to the fire, then stood back and watched as she settled into the chair with Jonah. The baby stirred, mouth puckering in sleep. Harlan looked around the room, taking in the quiet rhythm of it, the soft creak of the chair, the clock ticking slow above the mantel, the firelight on the floorboards. Something in it all settled deep in him, steadier than anything he'd known. He turned to Helena. I'll fix the window shutter tomorrow. She didn't look away from the baby. All right. But her voice was softer than before, and when she glanced up again, her eyes met his without flinching. The next morning broke with a fine crust of frost on the window panes and a faint orange light edging the sky. Harlan had already been outside, boots soaked from walking the perimeter of the clearing where deer tracks cut across the snow in clean arcs. When he came back in, he found Helena kneeling by the hearth, coaxing a low flame into steady heat with a twist of pine resin and dry bark. You're up early, he said, setting his gloves on the sill to dry. I was awake, she replied, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek with the back of her hand. Jonah stirred twice before dawn. I figured I might as well start the fire. He nodded once, then crossed to the table and began slicing through a wedge of cured venison. Helena worked in silence for a while, then rose stiffly and poured water into the tin pot hanging above the coals. I saw sewing needles in that crate by the cot, she said. If you don't mind, I'd like to make a proper sling for Jonah. That shirt won't last through spring. Use what you need, Harlan said. There's wool in the trunk, came from a trader last September. I'll look, she said, then paused. You've kept this place well stocked. I was planning to ride out come thaw. Hadn't figured on staying longer than winter. She didn't answer right away, just dipped a cloth in the warming water and wrung it out. Jonah, still bundled on the cot, gave a soft startle in his sleep but didn't wake. "You're not moving on now?" she asked, not looking up. "No," he said. "I'm not." She turned to face him then. "I'm not asking for you to stay, I know, but I'm not asking you to leave either." He set the knife down. "I wasn't waiting for your permission." The corners of her mouth lifted faintly, not a smile, but something quieter. Later, after Jonah had fed and the fire had been built up, Harlan cleared a small section of snow near the coop and opened the crate of fencing wire. He worked with slow precision, gloved hands steady, as he anchored the posts deeper into the frozen soil. Helena watched from the porch, Jonah bundled against her chest in the new sling she'd begun stitching from the wool cloth. "You planning to keep chickens?" she asked, voice raised just enough to carry. "Not unless they walk out of the woods and ask for lodging." She tilted her head. "Then what's the wire for?" "Garden, come spring." She stepped down carefully, boots crunching on frost. "You grow anything before?" "Once, back near Abilene, didn't have much luck. Too dry, no." "I wasn't patient enough to wait for anything to root." He stood and stretched his back, then looked at her. Jonah had fallen asleep, one tiny hand curled against her collarbone. "I could help," she said, "with the planting, with waiting." He didn't answer, just looked out toward the trees. She walked closer, stopping beside the half-built fence. "When my father died, my mother kept a garden for years. Squash, beans, summer greens. She said the only way to survive was to plant something you couldn't eat right away. That sounds like her." She was sharp about things. "Sharper than I was. You were young, too young to know what I'd carry with me," she said, adjusting the sling over her shoulder. "But I remember the way she worked. She never rushed, and everything she planted came up strong." Harlan picked up the spade again, but didn't set it to the ground. "You miss her?" "I used to. Now I just wonder what she'd think if she saw me now." "She'd say you're still standing." Helena glanced at him, then bent to pick up a loose coil of wire. "And what would your folks say if they saw you building fences in the middle of a forest?" "They'd ask why it took me so long to stop running." They worked in tandem for a while, Helena handing him tools as he sank post after post into the hard earth. The sun climbed higher and the frost began to melt off the eaves. Birds shifted overhead, small and quick. By midday, the fence was halfway done. Harlan leaned on the post-hole digger and looked toward the cabin. "You ever think you'd end up here?" "No," she said, brushing dust from her skirt. "But I didn't think I'd survive the last month either, so I suppose I've already gone past what I thought." He nodded, then looked at her, really looked. "You fit here," he said. "So do you." Neither of them moved for a long moment. Then Jonah gave a small hiccup and stirred, and Helena glanced down, adjusting the sling with one hand. When she looked back up, her eyes were steady. "If I stay," she said quietly, "it won't be as a guest. I wouldn't want you to. I'd need to be part of what's built here. You already are." Harlan stepped back, brushing soil from his palms. "Come spring, I'll ride into town, get more seed, a pair of hens if I can find them. Maybe a saw blade that isn't dulled to nothing." "I'll write a list," she said. He smiled then, the kind that didn't need explanation, and she smiled back, small, certain, and without hesitation. The thaw came slow that year. By late March, the snow had receded into the darker corners of the woods, and the creek ran louder, carrying branches and brittle leaves down from the higher ridges. Harlan had repaired the roof before the first rains arrived, laying fresh shingles where rot had set in. Helena had finished the baby sling and 3 new shirts for Jonah, all stitched from old flour sacks she'd boiled and dyed with walnut husk. They no longer measured days by the cold. Instead, by what grew. The garden fencing stood completed, and Helena had already turned the soil with a spade while Jonah napped in a basket under the porch eaves. She moved with easy rhythm now, the stiffness in her posture long gone. Her hands were rougher than they had been, but steady, sure. She'd taken to humming while she worked, soft and tuneless. Harlan returned from the ridge one morning with mud on his boots and a small burlap sack slung over his shoulder. "Found fresh shoots along the south bend," he said, setting the sack on the table. "Wild onion and dock. Might be more by the week's end." She wiped her hands on her apron. "You keep bringing home things that grow like you're trying to plant the whole country." I figure we start with what wants to live here. She opened the sack and pulled out a handful of greens, sniffing them. That's a good rule. He leaned against the doorframe, watching her. I saw a man down by the old rail cut. He had a mule and a wagon, said he was heading to Rock Springs. Did you speak to him? I did. Told him if he passed any traders, I'd buy a pair of goats come April. Figured it's time. She nodded, eyes on the leaves in her palm. You'd need a pen. I'll build one behind the shed. Helena looked up. Have you thought about what name we'd give this place? If anyone came asking, no one's come asking yet. But they might. He stepped forward slow. What would you call it? She held his gaze. Langley's Hollow, it's what my husband wanted to name his claim. Harlan didn't look away. He was a good man. He was kind and he tried. That's worth something. He nodded. Then it's settled. She turned back to the greens, voice quieter. You don't mind. I've never needed to put my name on a thing to know it's mine. That night, while Jonah slept in his crib near the hearth, Harlan brought out the book of poems he'd kept in the trunk. The pages were yellowed and brittle, but the words were whole. He set it on the table while she sewed patches onto one of his old coats. You ever read these? He asked. Not in years. He opened to a marked page and read aloud, his voice low, the cadence unhurried. She listened without speaking, her needle paused mid-stitch. When he finished, she folded the coat and set it aside. You never told me your father's name, she said. David Avery. What was he like? Hard to read. He didn't talk much, but he built everything with his own hands, never once bought a thing he could make himself. She smiled faintly. Sounds familiar. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers. I think he'd have liked you. Helena turned her hand beneath his, curling her fingers into his palm. Do you ever wish you'd done things differently? I used to. Not anymore. Jonah stirred in his sleep with a soft exhale, then settled again. The fire crackled low. Outside, wind moved through the trees like a slow tide, brushing against the cabin walls. Helena stood, still holding Harlan's hand, and drew him toward the hearth. She sat beside him on the floor, the quilt wrapped around them both. Her head rested against his shoulder, and he pressed a kiss to her temple, the gesture quiet, unforced. I never thought I'd feel safe again, she whispered. You are, he said. You always will be. They sat that way until the flames died down to embers, and the weight of winter vanished behind them. The cabin stood stronger by summer. The garden yielded its first crop of beans and squash, and wild strawberries grew along the edge of the path. Helena kept 2 goats now, and Harlan had finished the pen just as the rain stopped. Jonah had learned to sit up, his dark hair curling at the nape of his neck, his laughter full and sudden. One afternoon, Helena hung a painted sign on the gate, Langley's Hollow. The letters were uneven, but proud. They didn't marry with ceremony. One evening in June, Harlan carved 2 wooden rings from a branch of the ash tree behind the cabin, and they exchanged them beneath the porch as the moon rose. No preacher, no paper, just vows spoken with hands clasped and eyes clear. I never wanted anything I couldn't carry, she told him after. Then just carry me, he said, and she did. They grew together with the land. The scars they carried of grief, of loss, of long silence did not vanish, but they softened, made room for new things. Laughter, shared work. The comfort of a hand reaching back in the dark. They built a life, not grand, but whole. And in the quiet hours when the wind stirred the grass and the firelight danced across the walls, they would sit close, their shoulders touching, and know they'd come through the worst, together, forever.